It's absolutely disgusting. That's the explosive reaction from a furious Grimsby resident slamming Keir Starmer's latest move to strip winter fuel allowances from millions of pensioners. The backlash is ferocious, folks. Pensioners are outraged, and the numbers don't lie. 100,000 more elderly people pushed into poverty because of this decision. What's behind Labour's controversial cuts, and could this be the blunder that breaks Starmer's leadership? Stick around because we're unpacking every fiery detail of this unfolding political storm.
Keir Starmer's been in power for a few months now. He's had this big speech, big reset, big relaunch. He says it's not a reset, but it does sound like it's a bit of a reset. I mean, what do you make of how he's doing so far?
It's absolutely disgusting. He's slashing benefits. He's putting old age pensioner tax on the benefits. It's just wrong. I mean, come on. Old people, they've worked all their lives to raise money so they've got a comfortable state of life after they've retired, and then they're taxing it. It's not fair.
And what do you say to people who say, oh, in Grimsby, people should just get off their bums and, try and get a job. Other people can get a job. Why should we pay benefits? What would you say?
Well, what I'd say to them is, why don't you have a spell on benefits? Why don't you feel how we feel? One minute we're getting told we're going to get a pay rise, then the next minute we're getting told we're not going to get one, and the benefits are go up and down. The government are slashing it left, right and centre, and on top of that, they're capping out all the housing benefit. So when landlords in private properties and landlords want to up the rent, then the benefit that we get, we've got to pay half the rent to.
Plays Labour's winter fuel cuts have unleashed a tidal wave of public anger, and Sean Clarkson's fiery statement perfectly encapsulates the national mood. Pensioners feel betrayed. Starmer's move to cut winter fuel allowances has left 10 million elderly citizens, many already struggling with rising energy costs, without the £200 to £300 payment they've come to depend on. And while the Labour leader insists this decision is about prioritising the NHS, many see it as a heartless political misstep. Sean's outrage, aired live on GB News, was just the beginning. Across social media and community forums, pensioners and their families are railing against Labour's justification. The government has attempted to frame this as a cut to relatively wealthy retirees, but critics argue it's a blanket policy that fails to consider the middle ground. These aren't multi-millionaire pensioners losing out. Many of these individuals sit just above the eligibility line for pension credit, meaning they'll miss out on their winter fuel payments entirely. Starmer, in a round of local radio interviews, tried to defend his position. On BBC Radio Merseyside, he acknowledged the cuts were difficult, but claimed they were necessary to avoid deeper NHS budget shortfalls. Without the change we're putting in place, the allowance goes to everyone, whether they need it or not, Starmer said, adding, I think most people would say that doesn't make sense when you've got a really, really tight budget. But his words have done little to calm the storm. Pensioners are left asking why they're bearing the brunt of these savings when other areas of government spending remain untouched. The government's own impact assessment admits that poverty rates among the elderly are set to increase by 100,000 as a direct result of these cuts. Is this really the fairness Labour has been promising? Rachel Reeves, Labour's Chancellor, has added to the controversy by unveiling the supposed safety net for pensioners who lose their winter fuel payments. The £421 million Household Support Fund, distributed via local councils, is intended to provide grants of £200 to £300 for low-income pensioners. But critics say the scheme is riddled with flaws. Its reliance on pensioners knowing where and how to apply has already led to fears that thousands will slip through the cracks. Local councils, stretched thin by years of austerity measures, are struggling to keep up. Even with partnerships like Age UK, which helps provide quilts, heaters and emergency fuel payments, it's clear this is no substitute for the consistency of winter fuel allowances. Pensioners with less than £5,000 in savings can apply for support, but many argue the bureaucracy involved is demeaning and discouraging. And then there's the optics. Starmer's opponents are seizing on this policy as proof Labour has abandoned its working-class roots. The Tories have wasted no time jumping on this misstep, with MPs and ministers taking to the airwaves to hammer home their message. Labour is out of touch. Matt Vickers, the shadow policing minister, didn't pull any punches. Appearing on GB News, he accused Starmer of failing pensioners and misleading the public on other promises too. Vickers tore into Labour's pledge to add 13,000 police officers, labelling it a swizz. Starmer says 13,000 more police are coming, but the reality? He's counting unpaid volunteers. Meanwhile, actual officers are being taken off 999 response units to patrol neighbourhoods, Vickers said. It's all smoke and mirrors. This relentless attack from the Tories is hammering Labour at a time when they can least afford it. Starmer's first few months in power have been defined by budgetary constraints and difficult trade-offs. But decisions like these risk alienating Labour's core base. As if things weren't bad enough, Reform UK has entered the fray, siphoning off disillusioned voters. A shock opinion poll shows Nigel Farage's party overtaking Labour with 24% of the vote, compared to Labour's 23%. Reform UK is now projected to win 95 seats, wiping out traditional Labour strongholds across the North and Wales. Farage himself is already celebrating what he's calling a political revolution. Speaking at the Spectator Awards, Farage didn't mince words. Labour's collapse isn't just a blip, it's the beginning of a populist uprising. In 2029, there will be hundreds of Reform UK MPs in Westminster. Labour's leadership is clearly rattled. Behind the scenes, party insiders are reportedly scrambling to regain control of the narrative. But with public anger still burning over the winter fuel cuts, that might be easier said than done. The story doesn't end here, though. Across the UK, pensioners are organising protests, petitioning their local MPs, and demanding answers from the Labour leadership. Age UK has seen a spike in inquiries about support options, while social media platforms are awash with stories from pensioners terrified about how they'll afford to heat their homes this winter. Labour's attempts to soften the blow, like the Household Support Fund, are being dismissed as insufficient by advocacy groups. The additional support, which includes relief for fuel debts of up to £500 per household, may help some, but it's clear the damage to Labour's reputation is already done. Meanwhile, the Tories are celebrating what they see as vindication for their policies. Conservative MPs have been quick to point out their own record of increasing police numbers and expanding support for vulnerable groups during the winter months. While Labour faces questions about who they've left behind, the Tories are doubling down on their image as the party of compassionate conservatism. All of this leaves Keir Starmer in an increasingly precarious position. His leadership was supposed to mark a fresh start for Labour after years of internal strife and election losses. Instead, he finds himself battered by criticism from all sides: pensioners, political opponents, and even some within his own party. The question now is whether Starmer can weather this storm, or if these missteps will define his leadership moving forward. The stakes couldn't be higher. With Reform UK gaining traction and the Tories seizing the opportunity to paint Labour as ineffective, the next few months could determine the future of British politics. Starmer's back is against the wall, and he'll need more than just careful rhetoric to claw his way out of this one. Will he pivot to regain the trust of pensioners? Or will this be the beginning of the end for Labour's grand reset? One thing's for certain: this winter will be a cold one. Not just for pensioners, but for the Labour leadership as well.